This event is part of a project which TASC is carrying out on behalf of the National Worker Directors Group. And the National Worker Directors Group is sponsoring this event as part of, as I say, a project where we're looking at the question of employee voice in the modern company. And there are other events planned. There is another discussion, for example, on May the 11th, and you will find further information about the project and about these events on the website. Let me just say a couple of quick sentences about why TASC is interested in this issue. TASC is concerned with economic inequality and with, if you like, open government. The question of shareholder value connects to both of those. Because firstly, there are increasing arguments that claim that one of the reasons for the growing economic inequality that we've seen in rich countries over the last couple of decades is in part caused by a particular model of the firm, namely the shareholder value model. So we're interested in the issue of corporate governance and shareholder value from that perspective. Secondly, in terms of our second strand, open government and flourishing society, there are many voices that argue that the problem with a shareholder value model of the company is that it doesn't allow other stakeholders any influence at all, and furthermore, therefore closes off the workings of the company to, if you like, democratic inspection from outside. Now, I'm not saying we accept those arguments. I'm simply saying I think they're important arguments, and that is why we at TASC are interested in this issue. I don't have to do anything more now, because the people here are going to do the work, apart from introducing Derval McDonald over there, who, as you probably all know, is Group Business Editor of Independent News and Media, a company which needs no introduction. I have a long list here of her achievements, which I don't intend to read out to you, but simply to say, I'll mention the first one, that she was recently named Irish Tatler Media Woman of the Year. I actually think that's slightly backhanded, actually, because it kind of suggests, you know, rather sort of, dare I say, fashionable things, Irish Tatler. Actually, if you look at what Derval has been doing, she is a very, very serious, and in fact, I would say exemplary, probably the best business journalist that we have in Ireland. So I'm very pleased that she is going to organise your discussion this evening. Derval, over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much. What a gorgeous sunset, and what a fabulous evening, and a really amazing evening and week to be taking part in a debate and session on employee voice in the modern company. I was coming across in a taxi and just thinking of tonight, the night when the bus air and bus strike has been called. We'll get you out before that, I promise. You know, amidst concerns by employees about the direction of the company. It's the day after RTE unveiled its first series of job cuts, looking 200 to 300 jobs over the next 2 to 3 years. It's a week where peace of a certain kind broke out in the long-running Cleary's dispute following SIPTU's decision to withdraw the objection. It is a week where we saw not the first, but certainly the most high-profile invocation of our new protected disclosures legislation. It was a story I broke. It just happened to involve the CEO of the company where I work, although I had written previously about the legislation and how that's going to be used in Ireland, where we learned about Philip Green might be getting a €15 million or 50 million sterling rebate following developments in that particular pension row. And the week where we also learned that the top FTSE 100 bosses in the UK are earning, they get paid 386 times the national living wage in the UK. So there's plenty to be vocal about, plenty to discuss. And I have to say it's an issue that I'm not entirely settled on myself. I'm very, very much open tonight to having my mind changed by the various panellists and by yourselves in the audience, both as an employee as a citizen and as somebody who is very, very privileged to serve on boards. So I'm not quite committed to anything. I would have perhaps in the past said a little bit like Theresa May that I would have thought our unitary board system perhaps served us well. I know Jan is certainly going to challenge me on that, and it's interesting that one of the flagship policies of Theresa May was to bring more workers on board in terms of board representation, and then that suddenly changed very quickly when she says, well look, no, it's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about mandatory work councils, and I'm not talking about direct appointment of workers or having trade union reps on board. So I don't know about you, but I'm certainly looking forward to having my preconceptions challenged, and we have a superb panel to do that for you tonight. Bláthnaid Clark has the kind of CV that would just terrify you in terms of her accomplishments. I'll just limit it to a few. She is the McCann Fitzgerald Chair in Corporate Law at Trinity College Dublin, my old haunt, and she's a member of the European Commission's informal expert group on company law. She was one of the founding members also of the UCD Centre for Corporate Governance. Jan is a sociologist at the Amsterdam Institute of Advanced Labour Studies and the Law School in Tilburg, and he has written extensively on these issues, and I'd be really, really interested to see how we differ from our European peers in this regard. And Kevin Toland also needs no introduction, CEO of the Dublin Airport Authority since 2013, and obviously had a long-running and outstanding career with Glanbia in both its Irish and US divisions. What will be of particular interest is that there are 4 worker directors under the Irish legislation on the DAA's boards, so we'll be interested in maybe looking at those 3 dimensions. But Bláthnaid, I might start with you, because this is an area that is replete with terminology about stakeholder value, shareholder value, and when it boils down to it, when you cut through all of that terminology, what does it actually mean? What do those distinctions mean?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I think James talked earlier about employees having a voice, and so the way I look at it is the first question, and there are 2 questions, and they're both very distinct questions. And the first question is, should employees have a voice? And then the second question is, how should they exercise that voice? And they're 2 completely different questions that get mixed up. So the first question, should employees have a voice? So this is often called shareholder democracy, and there are really sort of 2 options. One question is, should shareholders have a greater role in decision making in a company? So who really is in charge of decision making? Should it be shareholders or should it be the board? And traditionally we've said it's the board. The board is in charge, the directors are in charge, and there are certain good things about that. So one in particular is that the board of directors are subject to fiduciary duties. They have a duty to act in the interests of the company. They're trained, they're expert, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about other governance issues which do need to be addressed there in terms of challenge and things like that. But they are, in theory, the experts. Then on the other side of that, there's, well, should shareholders be in charge of a company? Should they have more input into how it's run? And we're seeing certainly at European Commission level, there's a greater emphasis on shareholder engagement, get them involved. And in some of the issues, Derval, you mentioned pay. One of the particular policies, and we've seen it in America, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it now at Commission level in the Shareholders' Rights Directive, is get shareholders involved in that. So that's the first question. Who makes the decisions? And irrespective of which side you come down on, if you're talking about worker directors, you're assuming that the board of directors is the correct place for that decision making. But the second question is hugely important. The second question is, in whose interests should the company be run? So in whose interests should the directors run the company, or in whose interests should the shareholders exercising the power they've been given run? And remember that shareholders have no duty to anybody except themselves. They have no duty to the company, although that's an interesting academic area where there's a little bit of work being done. But back to the second question. So whose interests should they run? Should it be shareholders? And that's what we often call shareholder primacy or shareholder maximization, profit maximization. And I think there's probably no one in this room, certainly, who would argue that a pure focus on shareholder maximization is beneficial to anybody. After the crisis, we can't even say it's beneficial to shareholders. So the opposite end of that is, well, stakeholders. So should the company, should the board exercise its authority in the interest of a wider group of stakeholders? And so the answer, I think, most sensible people, and certainly since the crisis, and certainly we're seeing the reactions in terms of populism and Trump elections, issues like that, the answer there is, of course, it should be exercised in the interest of long-term sustainable value, because that benefits everyone in the long term. It doesn't benefit short-term shareholders, but that's a separate issue. So I think in terms of the ideal, we have to find a system where the powers of the company are exercised in such a way as to look after those broader stakeholder interests. That was what Theresa May was trying to do. I think on the stump, caught after the referendum, she said, well, we'll do it this way. We'll do it with worker directors. On reflection, and you can see it there's a green paper which has been published in the UK, where she sets out her stall and she's saying, okay, maybe not worker directors, but there are other ways of doing it that I'm sure we'll talk about, like advisory panels.
And when you look across the European landscape, it's quite mixed. 19 out of the 28 do have some form of workers' representation. It's a much smaller cohort, 13, in which they are quite extensive. Can you maybe just paint the scene for us a little bit in terms of Europe and where you see Ireland and our soon-to-be departed neighbour, Britain, within that context?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that on the continent there is very often the idea that Ireland is very similar to the UK, and I think that is certainly not the case. I mean, I've been dealing with and working with Irish colleagues for the last 35, 40 years, and I remember that in the late 80s, early 90s, social partnership, for instance, in Ireland was taken serious, whereas it doesn't exist in Britain, or does almost not exist in Britain. And that also, let's say, the development of a system of modern system of industrial relations was taken serious here. So in that respect, I think that if you look over it from let's say with a helicopter view, then there are serious differences between the Irish and the British model. Well, perhaps I should start with the kind of evolution in my own thinking, because that is part of the answer also. I've for a very long time I've worked in the field of social policy. Both at national level and at European level. And part of that was dealing with workers' voice, but from the social angle, dealing with workers' voice. And then at a certain moment you find out that if you don't enter into the hardcore of the European legislation, in the field of company law and so on and so on and so on, then you stay outside of the circles where the real decisions are taken. And that was for me and for a lot of colleagues, let's say, the reason to say, well, we should pinpoint much more on the workers' voice in that hardcore of the internal market. And it means that you have to enter into a debate with company lawyers, that you have to enter into a debate with public procurement or whatever. I mean, things that are normally said, these are technical affairs, they should not be polluted with social thoughts. What surprises then, of course, is that on the one hand, you have quite, let's say, different tradition over the 28 member states of the European Union. And there are also countries that have simply nothing. And that is also my experience of the last few years, that you see that if you strengthen the workers' voice, for instance, in company law or through a European Works Council directive or whatever, then it adds to traditions that are already there. But if there is no tradition, then then it doesn't work. So a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, they simply don't have this tradition, and it is difficult to implement it. It's copy-paste what is happening there. There is not one size fits it all. If you look at, for instance, in the country where I'm now living, in the Netherlands, it is very clear that most people say, well, we have a workers' force, but the workers' force in the Netherlands is the Works Council. Over a period of 40 years, the position of the Works Council has been strengthened, also in a legal sense. And it means, for instance, if there is a takeover and the Works Council is not consulted properly, and they come up with a negative advice, they can go to what is called the company court, the company chamber of the Amsterdam court, and they can block the takeover. So in that respect, we already have a problem with our neighboring German colleagues who say, well, but you are not in the board, you are not really in the board. And so there the tradition simply functions different, so to say. What we have tried to do now at European level is that we have said, well, there should be a kind of subsidiarity in those different forms, but it is not so much the place or the structure where you are in, but it is the function. It is the right to be informed, it's the right to be consulted, it's the right to have a say, whether that goes through the Works Council or to the board level representation or whatever. That is, I think, a very important thing. Connected to what Blannet has said before, the debate in the field of, let's say, company law, both at national level and also at European level, has not been of great help. There has been a shift away, for instance, from the starting point. As we started with the European internal market, the idea was we will harmonize our company law and create a kind of level playing field for all companies, all national entities that have this right of free establishment and go through that open market, so to say. That has been left behind in the mid-90s, and from that moment on it was competitivity. What does company law contribute to competitivity? And then the risk is there that in such an open market, and that is some of the things that I'm researching now, is that you are confronted with first short-termism, but also with all kind of artificial arrangements for tax reasons, for whatever reasons. And that is a complete change with what I was confronted with in, let's say, the late 80s, early 90s, where also captains of industry said, we want to produce good products, we want to produce good services. Now it is, well, we want to, asset stripping. That is the situation. And in that respect, let's say the second dimension of that evolution that I've also myself have undergone is that I more and more think that there are even arguments outside, let's say, the trade union circles, even outside the workforce, to say, well, we need much more of a stakeholder perspective. I mean, if you look at the companies that you have mentioned, and I can also mention a few companies, local communities have invested a lot, and they have no say about what happens.
Well, Kevin, if we can pick anything up from Jan, it's a little bit the tax harmonisation debate. It's a principle that's easy to assert sometimes, but much harder to implement. Obviously, we have a single tier board system, and we don't have any statutory entitlement for board representation for workers. But we obviously have our own culture and traditions, and two of those you've direct experience with, particularly in the agri-food sector and the development of the co-op system, and also that the statutory exception with the Worker Participation Acts, which facilitate obviously the worker directors on your own board. What do you think? What has been your experience in both Glanbia, where where a lot of times it was perceived as working with the farmers was very difficult, may not have been in practice, and after Glanbia in the DEA, how do you find the worker participation models that you've experienced to date?
Well, I found actually that the Glanbia model, thank you for having me this evening, we added nearly 250 jobs last year. We're going to add nearly 250 to 300 this year. So just for the record, a semi-state that's growing, developing. Just to position maybe the group before answering the question for a second is, I look after the DEA. I've been there 4 years. My previous career for about 25 years was in consumer goods companies, and I'll come back to that even before Glanbia because there's a relevance to the question. Dublin and Cork Airport are amongst the fastest growing airports in Europe. Dublin's the fastest growing major airport, hit nearly 28 million passengers last year, and really poised to be a truly major airport for the next 25, 30 years. Cork, we're back in really good growth, and between them they accounted for 99.6% of the growth in the Republic last year. We also have a retail business, which is in now 10 countries right across the world, and an airport management business in Saudi Arabia. We have 4 worker directors, 3 of whom I'm delighted to see here tonight, and they represent different parts of the business. I suppose if I take a couple of steps right on back from that, I worked originally in Coke. I then worked in Grand Metropolitan. I then went back to work in Coke for a couple of years before I worked in Glanbia. And the point in that was, if you take my career, I've worked in a Fortune 500 as a sole entity. I've worked for a FTSE 50 in Grand Metropolitan, the predecessor of Diageo. I then worked in Glanbia, which was a 54% cooperative control PLC at that point, and then in DEA, which is obviously owned by the state, but a truly commercial semi-state. Within that, people have asked me since I took over in the DEA, what's it like working for the government, and what's it like having a number of worker directors on your board? And it's a question I'm very relaxed with in both cases, because if I look at each of the businesses I've been involved in, what matters in a business to me are 4 real questions. One, what's the strategy, the vision and the purpose of the business? Where are you trying to get to and how are you trying to get there? Secondly is your customers, because if you can't do a good job with your customers, you'll have no business, irrespective of anything else. Thirdly is your people, because it's your people that will do the good job with the customers. And lastly, and very importantly, your shareholder. What do they want? How you communicate with them? What you're delivering? Are they aligned with you? And as I look across all the different companies I've worked for, those same 4 lenses apply. In Glanbia, we had 21 people on the board. There were 3 executive directors. There were 4 non-executive independent directors. So that gets me to 7, and there were 14 farmer directors, which is really people that were elected by the suppliers of the key raw material. If you like, in the DEA board, we have 13 members. There's the chairman and myself. There are 4 worker directors, and the balance are appointed by the shareholder. And really the question to me is the model doesn't actually matter that much at all. It's actually what you do with the model. And I see my worker director colleagues as equals. They're there to look after the company and the shareholder interest rather than to be a voice of the employees. Equally, the Glanbia farmer directors, it's what you do when you come in the door. How you got there is your route in, and in both cases it's a very well-established, sophisticated way of people becoming either worker directors or farmer directors. It's then actually what you do with the rest of your colleagues around the board, which comes back to the chair, it comes back to the sort of people you have, it comes back to the way everybody around that boardroom acts as a team together, and they've got different roles of the team to challenge, support, bring insight, bring wisdom, to tell management no, and then management have a duty to provide information, clarity. And one lesson I did learn in Glanbia, and I brought all the way through my career in DEA, is tell it as it is, put the issues on the table, and whether that's with a farmer director or worker director is exactly the same. And in fact, with other directors as well, they understand that management are really in the business of delivering strategy and sorting problems, and anybody that believes there aren't problems is living in a different world. So I find it a very simple, straightforward system, and it's really an implementation. If you've got a good strategy, and I see no conflict whatsoever in the models, I see no conflict in the question of shareholder value or stakeholder value or employee voice, because if you actually look at what makes a truly successful business, if it's run strategically for the long term, you've got to look after your customers, you've got to have your people feeling part of it, empowered, fully engaged and making a difference. You've got to do a good job for your shareholder, and then it'll all work out. And so I'm very relaxed.
Blonde, maybe Kevin's been very, very lucky because maybe it's just not as easy as it sounds, in the sense that if whatever route you came to a board, once you're there, you have fiduciary duties. You have to act you have to act up to those duties, and you have to act in the best interest of the company. So, is the sense of that if you bring an employee on, is it, does their role change once they get on? Because obviously if you're a director or you're on a board, you have very, very specific duties. And is there any sort of evidence to suggest that it is better or worse or indifferent for companies where there is greater employee voice, either on the board or in other models of engagement?
Okay, well, I suppose in terms of the empirical evidence is quite mixed. So, and I know the ETUI have done a lot of work on this, and there's been a lot of work done in the States as well and throughout Europe. So the difficulty with it is that even where you have companies that have been very successful, you can say there's a correlation, you can't prove causation. So that's one issue. So I think we don't even need to go there, though. I think the question is, do worker directors have a place? Do they deserve a place on the board as of right? So I think that's a different issue. When you look at what their role is when they get there, like any other person who's not a run-of-the-mill stale male, pale director, they will shake things up, because they have different expertise, they have different experience. And so in the same way that you can argue, and it's one of the arguments for diversity on boards, gender or ethnic diversity, that's all good, that shakes up the groupthink. In terms of duties, and all the directors here will know, as soon as you're on that board, your main primary duty is to the company, like every other director. And so if somebody says to you, are you different? Your duty is to the company like everybody else. Can you look after your own interests? Yes, you can. You can look to your, and again, you will know this, but you can look to your nominating members' interests. But if there's a conflict of interest, the company is paramount. And that's important. And we saw a little experimentation during the crisis with public interest directors there. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. But, their role is the same. The only thing I would add is that legally, that's the answer. Now, whether that's the public perception, that's a slightly different thing. And so the public may consider, well, you're the worker director. How could you allow these redundancies? So there's a communication issue there that really, I think in certain circumstances, I don't worry about the confidentiality issue. I think that's something that professionals can handle. The conflict, I think that's a little bit more difficult. Behavioural economics will suggest if there's a significant conflict of interest, it's very hard to make an unbiased decision. But I think the major problem is possibly just the communications issue.
Jan, in terms of, do you have a preferred or favourite model? Does it have to be employee representation on the board, or, is there another mechanism? Can a non-executive director or another person on the board be given a specific function to liaise and to do that all-important function of listening to the employee voice? Like, is there a specific model that you think is one that you think works best, perhaps, of all of the diverse models that we see?
Yeah. Before I give you the answer, first, it's interesting to react also a bit on what Blanetest says, because, if you talk about workers' voice, then you also have to realize that it is not self-evident for the trade union to come up with a strong plea. Certainly not in Europe. There are trade unions, and not the smallest ones, that have always been against it, because they say you should not sit on the chair of the leadership of the management of a company. And that was especially, for a very long time, the case for the largest unions in Italy and France, and also in Belgium. So in that respect, also in the ranks of the trade unions, there's quite a debate going on for quite a long period already about what model should we go for. I've heard that in the recent years, and I've seen that also not from inside, but very close to that debate, that for some reasons this position has changed in Italy and in France, because the unions now there also see that it could give them an additional voice to the system that they have, so to say. In Italy, the position is very strong because their negotiation rights were always very strong, and in France, through the works councils, they have a strong influence in the company. If we could start from the scratch, it could be interesting to look at the German experience, because in fact, the very first model in Germany that was elaborated directly after the Second World War was the so-called Montanbestimmung. That's the regulation in the iron, steel and coal industry. And there was a 50% share of board level representations from the shareholder side and from the owner side and from the workforce. And the interesting thing is that although they, of course, also had to deal with very sensitive issues, that they developed a system that was very stable, and that, and although there is no, for instance, like Leonard said, there is no real evidence that this also was the reason why Germany and Austria and the Nordic countries survived and did better in the crisis. On the other hand, it is clear that it probably has helped, so to say. But then you have to take responsibility. So the trade union workforce also has to be ready to do that. To say, okay, we get to a difficult situation. Now we have to also develop this social partnership in difficult times, so to say. But we cannot start from the scratch. Because otherwise, I think it would be a very interesting model to go for that 50-50 approach.
And it was that kind of, it was the German approach in particular that, Kevin, that Theresa May seemed to balk away from once, as you say, I think she was sort of bounced in some respects into promising the protection for workers. It was interesting, the FT had a survey just about a month before she announced that policy, in which a lot of the CEOs of UK companies were not as averse to worker participation on their boards as people may have thought. But obviously she identified in particular the German system as something that the UK didn't want to work towards. Do you have your own even ideas around a model that, if we were to move to perhaps extend the workers' participation or to have a much more formal statutory model here in Ireland, that you think would or could work?
Well, I've got a view that there shouldn't be an extension to a forced model for, it depends shareholder by shareholder. Our shareholder has chosen a certain model, just like in my prior life they had a certain model. But I think what it actually comes down to, like most things in business, is model is one thing, it's how you implement it, what you do is far, far more important, firstly. Secondly, what you require having, for example, worker directors on your board is a really strong, good chair. Yeah. You require good, strong worker directors with a level of sophistication from the whole board. And what I mean by sophistication is that
there's quite a bit of snobbery around worker directors in certain quarters, you know, in terms, there is stating not offering a unit, but in terms of that, how important is it that, you know, that there is that appropriate training and sophistication from all of the board?
Well, I was thinking sophistication in a different way. I have to say, to be fair to my guys, snobbery is not something I've ever ran across.
No, I mean a broader. There can be a broader snobbery towards it. I don't mean obviously our directors.
It sort of starts off with the chair and the tone and the way the chair is very inclusive or not, and treats everybody on the board as equals and tries to make sure that everybody's appropriately heard. And then I think it comes back to me as manager, making sure that I treat every single person on the board as an equal, share information, share what's going on. Be very direct, very straightforward, and look, as any sensible manager will do, to actually get wisdom and insight and take fair challenge and seek that as a way of testing strategies, testing weaknesses, and being prepared to say you're wrong or you'll come back again. But I think where it gets into, though, is that when I say sophistication, I mean that the worker directors generally, like the farmer directors, have came through a system of election. They've came through experience in leadership in different roles within a different constituency than the board.
So there's something very different to offer.
So there's something different to offer, but they also have people and followership skills that they've attained to get there in terms of people vote for them in our case, and it's a formal voting process. I suppose then, I mean, sophistication is that in stakeholder, because I think of it more as differing stakeholders, and there'll always be conflict in stakeholder relationships at periods of time and over particular issues. Really good stakeholders work their way through those, so they don't let those conflicts put them in adversary or sort of at odds with one another. I suppose the second thing is that everybody recognises that when there are conflicts, what they are, how they should be handled. And then I suppose thirdly is that people on the board all understand and are led by the chairman when there's a slip on any side into an accidental conflict, that they're sophisticated enough to recognise and move on from. And I must say I found it very, very straightforward and good support, because they understand the business, they understand it better than non-executive directors from the outside. Good challenge, which is not always as much fun as the chief executive because they understand the business. But I think it's very sensible, and particularly in a business like ours where there's a massive dependency on people right across all of our businesses. They bring a lot of good challenge, good support, and a lot of value in the boardroom. And I think that word, I think you used, of diversity, that's a key thing that you want in any board. You want diversity, you want people that will understand governance, you want people that will understand the strategy, buy into it, contribute to it, the issues, understand and recognise that business is about the identification of issues and opportunities and dealing with them. So I think you're looking for all of those things. I do think you make a point that's a very valid one, that I would distinguish the farmer sector and particularly ICOS in, is that they spend a lot of time helping people develop so that when they show up,
they have an amazing training system in terms of
training and development and exposure. And also for the farmers, they get elected locally, then into a region, then they get to the board, and it's like snakes and ladders. If they lose their bottom role, they fall all the way down.
Well, just you mentioned earlier, and I suppose sometimes, because I think what Kevin was talking about is that it's not just the form but the substance of it. And you know, it's fair to kind of describe our post-crisis experiment with public interest, you know, directors. And I think people had a lot of faith in them. How did that work out for you? And you think in practice?
I think that the lesson, well, just to explain. Public interest directors were initially appointed in 2008 to the covered institutions. You probably already know this. But what's interesting is that for that 2-year period, they were identified as the public interest directors. Therefore, they were the people acting in the public interest. And initially, if you look at it, I think it was sort of an experiment. Partly it was to safeguard the huge amount of money we had just entrusted with these institutions to make sure that governance was improved. And these were people who were responsible, who had proven track records, and it was public money. But I think what was interesting is the fact that they were then identified as the people on the board to look after public interest. Now, 2 years later, they changed everything and they said, I think correctly, all directors are public interest directors. And so when I hear talk about, and I think the analogy is the same with worker directors, every director on a board has responsibility to the employees. Every director on the board should be saying, well, what are the implications? And we've learned that in the financial crisis again, where we distinguish between the risk officer, you know, or the risk director. This person is in charge of risk. We all know now risk management is the function of every director, and the same looking after stakeholders. And the problem which materialised with the public interest directors is, as I referred to earlier, if anything went wrong, if there was a conflict of interest, and you, as you correctly say, there are conflicts on boards. You can't run a business without a conflict between different stakeholders. But the problem for the public interest directors, as we saw it, and looking at the media reporting, was that they were always expected to side with the public interest. and as it was perceived to be. So what do you actually mean by public interest? What's in the interest?
There may not have even been any unanimity
so
on that.
you saw it arise in issues where, for example, repossessions, very difficult decision, all sorts of issues to consider, passing on reductions in interest rates from the ECB. Again, you're trying to get the banks up and running, a business model, all sorts of conflicts. So I think these are the same issues that the public, that worker directors can have if the communication strategy doesn't work. The one interesting thing with the public interest directors was there was a sort of an often overlooked section in the legislation which said that their overriding duty was to the public interest. And if there was a conflict between public interest and the entity, you're there for the public interest. So that's not something, and I don't think that's I don't think that was a good idea, and that's not something which we have in relation to the public, or in relation to employee directors.
Yeah, and you've kind of pointed out the Herculean task of trying to get sort of any harmonisation or even trying to start from scratch. But in your view, is it a carrot or stick approach? It's a little bit like trying to get more women on boards. People are very, very divided in terms of should it be quotas, should it be targets, should it be public pressure, peer pressure, or other things. In your view, is it a carrot or stick approach, or is it a mix of both? And have you any kind of even examples of where you think it has worked best, and it might involve some or none of the above?
Well, to talk about women on board, there it is quite simple. There has to be a quota. That has to be quoted. I mean, the experience all over Europe is that it only functioned in Norway. Why? Norway started with a voluntary scheme and it didn't work, and then they came up with, they quoted it, and from that moment on it functioned. So, and Spain later on also they went that way. And I mean, even in countries where there is a kind of sophisticated voluntary scheme, it doesn't function. So I think that in that respect, with regard to diversity and women, I think that it's simply necessary to make a mandatory quota. The problem, I wanted to pick up this about this public interest directive, because I think it's a very interesting thing. Nevertheless, the problem is, first and for all, what is a company? Is a company a community with different actors that have different interests and they have to come to a deal? Or are we far away from that community model, and is the company, let's say, a vehicle that has to deliver? And the problem is, of course, we are talking mainly about listed companies. We are not talking about family, this medium-sized family owned, where the family still says these are all workers, or this is our local community, and so on and so on. We are more and more confronted with, for instance, hostile takeovers. Take the Unilever case. The Unilever is, there is a hostile takeover, and there is a group of activist shareholders that is very sympathetic to that. Why? Because they want to cash. And they want to split up the company. They want to asset stripping. I mean, and the question, of course, in such a situation is then, is it possible to create coalitions between the workers' voice, even the local management that says, well, this is not what we want to, and even part of the board that says, well, this is not our philosophy of how a company should function. If you are in a situation where, let's say, it no longer matters how these different actors come to an agreement, because it's the ownership that gives the ultimate, so it takes the ultimate decision, yeah, then there are serious risks for local community, for workers, for all those that don't have the choice to take the money and run.
It's a topic I was amused in a sort of horrific fashion when I attended the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year at a debate entitled, the angry middle classes, what are we going to do about them? And, very robust debates about capitalism and globalisation and protectionism and how awful it was. And it seemed to be awful for those in the room. There was a disconnect really between this debate and everyone else. But I suppose the questions that Jan is raising really goes, it's a philosophical kind of intrinsic question which goes to the heart of the legitimacy and the functioning of a market economy. And it's certainly in the wake of the crisis, Bláthnaid, it's something that we have been discussing, and kind of what is the purpose of a company and what is the value. And I suppose that was making us rethink, or at least perhaps think properly for the first time about the value of a company. Do you find, Kevin or Bláthnaid, now in the wake of the crisis, that companies themselves are they're being held to account, whether it's by their customers? Just look at what happened with Uber. Just, look at what happens with other brands very, very quickly. And the public or your consumers can turn on you. Do you think that is something that is being much, much more considered at board level?
I think it is. And I think but we are dealing in an immediacy age where consumer advocacy, speed at which problems and information are shared is radically different than before. But I was thinking as Jan was talking that when I was in Glanbia and I was on the board, I lived in America for 10 years and I ran their international businesses. We were the largest cheesemaker in the US. And in one of those businesses in Idaho, we had no representation whatsoever from the suppliers on the company management or the board or anything. We didn't need to, we didn't have it. But we still had to make sure we paid a good price for milk or we wouldn't have a milk supply. We didn't have the luxury that you had in Ireland in the cooperative system, people aligned to a co-op, and unless a co-op goes bust, they actually stay there. So the milk is sure. The worker directors, in that sense of the farmer directors, are on the board. We also set up a brand new business, which is one of the most successful businesses ever set up in dairy globally in New Mexico. We partnered an innovative business model with local cooperatives, and we invested together. We had a supply of milk agreement. We had a management agreement. We co-invested and we ran the company, they provided the raw material, and we had a joint board. So really, point in all that is I'm absolutely agnostic, and there's too much thought on the model, and particularly post the crisis, there is a danger of over-regulation, over-governance, and not enough focus on implementation and clarity. So I think for sensible businesses that think of the long term, their purpose, of a good strategy, and recognise and value their different stakeholders, it's horses for courses. I think that the real danger is that it could be too much of we've 7,500 things to tick or do to say we're fully compliant, but we actually are so busy complying we haven't stood back and say what are the real issues, what are the real risks. I think the words managers in terms of risk, everyone is a risk manager. And when you're in business, you're in the business of risk, identifying it, managing it, eliminating it, suffering it. And I think it is a critical issue for a board, and one that, one of my jobs running our company is to make sure our board understands what's going on, how we're doing, the issues, the risk, in a simple, clear, honest, up-to-date fashion, and to make sure that as management, one of our duties is to serve the board with a context and an opportunity often enough, and with their sleeves rolled far enough up. I think that's the more important question, and I don't think you can legislate, and I don't think you can force a model to make that happen.
Before we go to the floor, Bláthnaid, sustainable capitalism is another one of those buzzwords that we hear a lot, but to what extent have factors such as short-termism, quarterly reports, the pressures that companies are under have been militating against their ultimate purpose, their long-term value, to the exclusion of a whole load of factors, including the voice of the employee?
Yeah, I think it's been very problematic, and again, it depends on the type entity you're talking about. So with listed companies, it has certainly been a major contributory factor to the financial crisis. So the difficulty was that it was in the interests of shareholders to take short-term decisions, to bet on short-term plans, and to bet on property bubbles, to lend, no downside risk, lots of no upside risk, it's just that was part of the problem, and there was nothing to stop it, and there was a lot to fuel it. So incentive remuneration was based on, again, short-term incentives. So you had management incentivized to take these short-term decisions. So short-termism is problematic, but it's part of the market. And, you know, Jan talked about in a takeover context. So often in a takeover context, there's a lot of criticism for hedge funds coming in and making short-term decisions. And that was one of the issues in Cadbury in the UK. But you've got to ask the question, well, who sold their shares to the short-term managers to allow them come in and do this? And the answer was, well, the long-term investors. And again, in a lot of cases, they were, you know, pension funds looking after our interests where we made money. So, you know, can you say they made the wrong decision? Can you say short-termism, which is a strategy rather than a type of shareholder, you know, was that negative? So I think in cases like that, you have to put in, and that's where I would disagree slightly, you need regulation to protect employees in those sort of circumstances, because you can't rely on shareholders and certainly not asset managers in those contexts. And trying to do it is difficult. You know, we've seen attempts to do it in the UK where there's, you know, a code and this is something that, you know, should be followed by asset managers. Is it going to work? Well, not necessarily, because there are different interests, they're conflicting, and there are different incentives. So that's where I think you really have to look to see where the market isn't working, where you can't leave it to the market. That's where you need regulation.
Sort it out. So we're going to go to the floor. There is a roving mic. If you could maybe just, when you ask your question or give your contribution, tell us who you are and where you're from. This is the bit where I get to be like Davina out of Big Brother. The reason the only thing you need to worry about the video is that it's a bit like being on Big Brother. It's live and you cannot swear or do anything else that might get us into trouble. But you might let us know who you are, where you're from, and who you want to direct your question to. What I want maybe the panel to consider, maybe because I think it'll form part of the debate later, is, you know, given those figures in the UK that were released earlier this week, you know, some FTSE 100 bosses earning 165 times what a nurse or anyone else in the UK might earn. Would the presence of worker directors or greater employee engagement have led to such a gulf in that executive pay? But I might go, who's going to be brave and go first? Here we are, front row. Thanks. Thank you.
Barry Nevin, Worker Director with Dublin Airport Authority. Firstly, it's just a few points, and I'm trying to convince you of the argument here tonight with some facts and Jan touched on it. He's probably referring to the ETUI research that the countries that had the least worker participation in their companies fared the worst in the recession. The companies that had the best participation, those countries did far better and came through quicker through the recession. So that piece of research is there. There was other UK research in relation to the recession that on average shareholders only stick around for 3 months of an investment. And the pressure they put on the executive team then to crystallise profits and to maximise their investment is very, very damaging to the companies. And that issue has to be looked at in relation to it as well. And again, just I would say with Kevin, because I've been through a number of boards over the years, I think the chairman is very important to the board. The chairperson, whoever they may be, sets the tone and sets how the board operates. And I've seen a number of different chairmen, and they all bring their own styles to it, but the chairperson is very important to the board as well. And then just finally to say that whether you're politically appointed or you're elected through the Worker Participation Act, everyone that comes there has a set of skills. I've never seen anybody that doesn't bring some element of knowledge, skill base, and between everyone coming up with, after a debate, after we get the information, and when people bring in the discussion before we make a decision, that's the important thing, and it's the broad element of it. And I would also say there is a big issue for female participation on the boards. I don't know whether quotas is the way to go, because you same as a male on a quota, you want the best people.
the quotas divide women as much as anyone else.
I know that from other organisations, and a lot of women are not happy with quotas. They want the best person coming through, be it male or female. I don't know how we get over that, but in the elections, a lot of women stand for election, but for one reason or other, sometimes they do get elected, sometimes they don't. Sometimes guys don't get elected for various reasons. So it's a big debate, and I welcome this. This is the first time ever that I'm the chair of the Worker Directors Group for this year at the moment, and I think this is the first debate that we've had on this, and I welcome it. So thank you very much.
Many thanks for your contribution. Is there anyone else to just take before we go back to the panel? Anyone else there? Just down at the back, this gentleman there. Thanks ever so much.
My name is Donald Dart, DCU.
Hi there.
Hi. Look, I found this very difficult. It was like being in a bog and a heavy fog. I couldn't really understand the drift of the sort of discussion on the panel at all. Firstly, worker democracy has been around since the 19th century. Nobody, well, apart from your reference to co-determination, nobody mentioned it. Look, how can you talk if you don't set the discussion in some sort of context? That you haven't done. But happily, I'm going to do it for you.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Not at all. 1921, the Whitley Committees in Britain. After 1945, you had co-determination in Germany, which there was a general strike to preserve because the employers opposed it. Then, during the 1970s, in the European Union, when the European Union was in its social democratic phase, you had worker participation opposed by employers throughout Europe and indeed from Japan and America. International solidarity, a good example of it. We know where it went really nowhere. Here in this country, opposition from the employers. So that's just the beginning.
Would you have a question for the panel?
I do.
Please
Indeed.
direct it.
Yeah, I do indeed. Should employees have a voice, you asked. Well, should they indeed? You were asking that question, the corporate governance person.
Yes.
You were asking the question, should employees have a voice? Well, do you think they should or they shouldn't?
So what I said...
I think you answered that in the affirmative.
But I said that there are two questions. So the first question is, should employees have a voice? And where should that voice be? And that's the first question. So that goes to the different type models. Should they have a voice on the board? Should they have a voice feeding into the board, as has been suggested in the UK? That's the first question. The second question is, when they're exercising their voice, what other stakeholders should they look out for? So should they look out for a broader range of stakeholders? And so my answer to both was yes, employees certainly should have a voice. I would subscribe to the idea of a company as an entity and as a community of interest. That's what it's set out to be. And therefore, yes, certainly there is a voice. How that's done and the model that's done, I think that's where the discussion is. And then the broader range. So employee directors, like every other director, has a duty to act in the interests of the company, which includes looking after other stakeholders as well. So that was my point.
No difficulty in accepting trade unions and worker directors on the board, I take it.
I didn't say that there was no difficulty with it. I think there are issues, and I think that these are issues that, in the same way, if you ask, should there be a consumer representative on the board? Should there be, so there are issues to look at, and there are different models, and some models will suit certain companies and some won't. But certainly their interests have to be taken into account.
And Jan, you articulated that in your contribution in terms of there is no one-size-all model. And a lot depends on the culture and traditions that have grown up in the various countries.
Yes, but
including Ireland.
for me, workers' voice is no debate. It has to be there, except for what I wanted to say is that, there can be different forms.
Yeah.
And that depends also on the tradition in a country and so on and so on. I mean, look, in France, trade union membership in France is extremely low, but the impact of, for instance, the French Comité d'entreprise, the Works Council, is huge, and they also have a tradition of collective bargaining that is very strong, certainly if you compare it with the British situation. Now, I would like to say something, and that is links a bit to what has been said, but it also shows how let's say, to what kind of strange contradictions the system as it functions now can lead. And of course, this is again a relatively negative example. There are also good examples. There are good entrepreneurs that want to, and so on. But this is a negative one. Last week I had a talk with a workers' representative in the board of Unilever. Interesting, British Dutch group, and he is from Germany. It's a workers' representative from Germany in the board. And he said, well, there is now, with this hostile takeover, an indirect effect, but that indirect effect has nothing to do with what we produce. It has nothing to do with the economic value of the company. It has nothing to do with our productivity or whatever. We have to keep the dividend high.
Yeah.
And that's schizophrenic. So what you see is that, let's say, the Kraft Heinz comes in with a hostile takeover, and we have to keep the dividend high, and we have to get rid of our environmental good record, because of that environmental good record, our profit level is not high enough. I mean, that's the situation where you are in, if only the money counts. And I mean, there is no better argument than say, well, but we are all for a green economy. We are all, we hope to keep the globe upright, and so on and so on. So that there is no better argument to say, well, there should other people sit on the table to decide what the future of this company is.
Go back to that question, Kevin, of executive pay, because there is that argument of, well, look, if it's, if there were more employees on board, or there were other stakeholders represented, maybe that executive pay gap wouldn't have got so high. Do you think that the voice of the employee on a board or in another system where it is adequately heard and represented would have reduced that gulf, or could reduce it in the future?
It could, but I think it actually makes no difference. I think what you would think is board directors together would look at things like that in the remuneration committee. I think I did take note of the number. I'll be talking to my colleagues to get my multiple right. But that speaks to shareholder. But I think that there are other ways of governing things like that. I was thinking of what Jan was saying there about the Unilever piece. The issue there is if you're a public company, you take the public's money, and you've got to be prepared for the road that's ahead of you, and the choice for Unilever is either to be sold, to do what it has to do with the dividend, to stop somebody buying it, or to look to become private. Because that really is a choice question. I think of the gentleman at the back's question about employee voice. It's only a very short-sighted business executive would want to do anything except have their employees have the maximum voice. Because that's what makes a maximum difference in having a good, successful, strong company, whether you're growing and doing well, as at the moment we're delighted to be doing, or whether you're facing tough times and you need to work together, because it's about working together in whatever to either maximise opportunities or deal with issues. I think where I would differ slightly is you could end up very quickly with a licorice all sorts around a board table, which is I'm the public interest representative, I'm an employee voice representative, I'm a this, I'm a that, and suddenly you no longer have, as Barry talked about, differing skills, and everybody brings a differing skill. With a good chairman, the voices are heard and add value together, and then you have a strong board that helps the company do very well. I think the
and
danger
as said,
is
legally that can't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think if you start into and I was listening to the public interest comment you made, and I go, God, the last thing you would want is someone saying, sorry, I'm stepping out from, because it's cabinet responsibility at a boardroom. And that's why you do need a good chairman that actually has good consensus and debate, listen to make sure things are heard, rather than everyone saying, well, I'm here for this, and then you get a sort of a dromedary, you get sort of multi-humped camel. The other thing you do in regulation, I'm on the record, is I think regulation is fine in areas that need to be regulated. Over-regulation isn't, and we are in some ways over-regulated, and things like safety, security, absolutely welcome it. Proper corporate governance are welcome it, but the danger is that people say we'll regulate everything so bad things can't happen. And then, well, bad things may not happen, but good things may not happen either.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there one more question here? Sorry, this gentleman, I know you've been waiting. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Ted Murphy. I'm retired now, but I was very involved in the setting up of the worker democracy and the election of worker directors in Aer Lingus back in the 70s, and it came out of the first, the coalition programme, as I recall. It was a promise. And if I can start off by making an observation, when you talked about French and Italian unions and their attitude towards boards and worker democracy, I think you've got to remember, and you obviously realise this, but just to emphasise the point, that many continental unions are politically based and are aligned with the Communist Party, and therefore come to this discussion with political motivation rather than pure worker representation. And that is a factor in how the continental unions react, or did react to this type of development.
Yeah.
If I may interrupt you,
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that doesn't count for the Belgian unions,
No.
even the Belgian Christian unions, but the Belgian unions, both the strong unions, are for non-political reasons are against it. But anyway,
No, but
for the Italian and the French
It was
situation,
certainly the case, and I also just make the point in passing that democracy and the way it was established in Germany was established at the direct order, if you like, of the American occupying power, which is a fascinating thought now, because they saw it as a way to preclude the growth of fascism in the boards of the companies like Krups and Thyssen and Siemens has had before the war. So just interesting to note that. But I'm struck by one thing as you talk about it, that as you talk about it, you, the panel, talk about it, you talk about it, to my mind, purely in the sense of worker democracy as a shareholder value. There has been no discussion of what worker democracy or worker involvement on the board means, or how it looks to the worker at the shop floor and what it means to them. And I want to put it to you that in my experience, when we elected worker directors in Aer Lingus, and when we went on, and Aer Lingus, as you know, went through a number of crises, although not as many as people imagine, and Aer Lingus was more successful than it's generally presented now. But at the same time, during the periods of crisis, the worker directors refused to report to the trade union leadership in Aer Lingus on what was actually being discussed, because they said they were bound by confidentiality, which made it actually impossible. Now, I just make it a point as an aside that I discussed this with colleagues in the US Airline Pilots Association, who at one stage were the biggest owners of airline shares in the world, US Alpa. And I asked them what they did, and one of them, who was a director of a large, very, very large American airline, told me that when he went to the board, made it quite clear that he reported to the president of his union, and that the confidentiality of the board extended to the higher executives of his union. And I put it to you now, that is a concept we have to bring in here, because there's no point having worker directors on a board if you cannot actually get a feedback, a proper feedback from the floor as to what you're actually asking them to do.
I think, Bláthnaid, that was something you were kind of suggesting earlier, kind of the complexities around that. Like, I mean, because obviously you have a voice when you're on the board, but then to whom are your obligations due? And is it due if you're a representative from the employees when the proverbial hits the fan, or otherwise? Then who is your reporting duty to, and to what extent is that, and I suppose, but maybe that's different if it's a board position, but then when you look at some of the other models around Europe where it might be a supervisory style thing or it might be a non-executive, look, what are your views on that confidentiality and the duties that you owe as the workers' representative, but also as a member of, in Ireland we have a unitary board, but it's kind of complex, those legal and moral duties that you may have.
It is. I mean, it's as you well know, it's hugely complicated. So the lawyer will tell you your duty is to the company, and you have a duty of confidentiality. I think there's also an argument that where information is made available to you in the context of a takeover, that part of that information is made available to you qua employee rather than qua director. And so that can be an important distinction. So I suppose wearing your director's hat, the argument you make is this is information that has to go to the employees. And in certain cases, that can be done subject to confidentiality arrangements and issues like that. But it's very tricky.
Yeah.
There is some jurisprudence in this respect. I think it was in Germany where it was possible for a board-level representative to discuss with the Works Council and even with the trade unions, but then the confidentiality was extended to them. But it made it possible. It gave the Works Council the opportunity also to prepare themselves better in a consultation process. So in that respect, but confidentiality is also something that you can negotiate about, and that you should do in the full field, I think.
Because Kevin, you were saying you haven't experienced a difficulty with confidentiality.
No, well, I think my board colleagues are there as worker directors, that they were elected by the workers. They're there to operate like any other director on behalf of the company. And I know we have a particular style, which is tell it as it is, provide as much information in the simplest, clearest form for all the directors. And I think you would run into all sorts of problems if you were saying, well, is this confidential, that not? I think it puts the worker directors actually in an invidious position.
Absolutely.
I think it then also it puts them in a position of creating conflict and slippage because they become a representation unit. Now, and if you take the comment the gentleman made about the trade union representation, we have a variety of trade unions. I know all of my colleagues are not selected or elected by a trade union. They're elected by a variety of workers across the workplace. I also have quarterly briefings with the trade union representatives and the officials of all the unions, union by union, where we exchange what's going on in the company, the challenges, the issues. I hear the perspectives and the challenges and concerns of the union colleagues, and
it goes to heart of what you said earlier, communication.
But that then goes back to there. Absolutely, I'm absolutely expecting that. That's something that they will communicate to their membership, and that's an absolutely good forum for making it happen.
I'll just let this gentleman finish.
I accept, and I mean, certainly the experience in Aer Lingus was that communication did improve tremendously because of that. But yet, I'll make the point to you that when you talk about confidentiality, if the worker directors, and I accept they're elected by all the staff, if they're not reporting back to the people they were elected by, and the voice of the people they were elected by is the trade unions, even though the electorate in fact is larger, if they're not reporting back, of course you don't have a problem with confidentiality, because they're not saying anything.
Sorry, just to be awkward, but I don't think their actual job is to report back. I think their job is to go into the boardroom, represent the company, and to provide their input, challenge, like any other director at the board. And I'd have the same issue if one of my worker director colleagues or another member of the board happened to run into someone in town and tell them what was going on in our board.
No, I'm not suggesting that, and it's unfair of you to say that.
No, but I'm just suggesting confidentiality is a very clear prerequisite. You either have it or you don't. I think sort of having gradients of it is a very slippery slope for all.
No, I accept confidentiality. All I'm saying to you is that he used the word negotiated, and I believe that's actually right. In the circumstances we're talking about, I'm suggesting to you that confidentiality has to be negotiated and is based on trust. But, and accept that. I just make the final point to you, if I may, that in my view, when I got involved with trying to set up the system in Aer Lingus, I considered that when we talk about democracy, if you like, or participation of workers at the board, it also has to mean that those attitudes that we're trying to bring to the board have to permeate down through the company. And that's not always the case.
Yeah.
You know,
that's very true, Blondin, isn't
but
it?
that's also the only way it can flourish.
well, yes, no, I agree with you.
It's not always a very smooth, circular thing, Blondin, is it? It's
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, there's no point in paying lip service to it at all.
Or having tokenism.
Exactly. And I think what's very clear for all these issues, whether it's proper risk management, whether it's looking after stakeholders, whether it's diversity, is you have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Yeah. And so people talk about tone from the top, which is important, but also you need the people who are actually implementing those decisions to bear it. The word which is used is it has to be embedded in every fibre of the company, and I completely agree with you on that.
It would be better if it grew organically from the bottom. Unfortunately, it's imposed from the top, and it doesn't.
It shouldn't be imposed. It should be part of the. I think it should be part of the culture and values of the.
Well, sorry, no, you're right.
And I do not agree with you completely that it should grow up from the bottom, because I've seen too often that there was a fruitful dialogue, but that there was a change of management, and all of a sudden it was interrupted. So the interesting thing is I did quite some research in the Netherlands related to Works Council work, and there we also found out what makes a Works Council functioning. And you can talk about rights, you can talk about regulation, and so on and so on and so on, but if there is not that tradition of dialogue, that climate also to make something out of it, and that is also our experience now with the European Works Council or whatever, then it hangs somewhere in the air, and that is a risk. And another thing is that has to do with confidentiality again, especially with regard to this situation, the role of trade unions. We just wrote a book last summer about takeovers and how the European directive has been implemented and how that functions in the different traditions all over Europe. And interesting is that we found out that in Belgium, for instance, if there is a major restructuring, the trade unions have the right to be informed at a very early stage, even before the whole formal workers' voice starts. Why? Because the trade union is seen as the principal workers' voice, and that is enshrined even in, let's say, in the system of industrial relations there.
So, Blondin, short of directly appointing workers to the boards, and sometimes it doesn't always work, the workers themselves may not be happy with a system like that, are there any other sort of protections or initiatives that can be introduced, whether it is, as Jan said, to increase the flow of communication, to bring people on board at an early stage? You know, if you were, minister for a day and you had a whole day to kind of come up with one or two initiatives, what would it be? What do you think would help the situation?
I think it's interesting because we're watching them do this exactly in the UK. That's exactly the debate, and they've set out their stall and a number of options, and they've consulted. So we'll see some of the views. One of the ideas is that one of the directors on the board should be appointed as the sort of go-to person on employee issues. I'm concerned for the reasons I mentioned before, that they will be the token person and everyone will leave it to them. What I like about it, though, is the aspect I like about it is that there should be more communication, so there should be more dialogue. But I don't see why that has to be left to just one director to do. I think all directors, should be in a position to do that. I think there's also, you talked about, do we want more regulation? And the answer in some cases is no. But you want smarter regulation. And so one of the issues, and it's very interesting, there's a project going on in the UK at the moment called the Purposeful Company. And it's looking to see, well, what should a company do and how should we deal with some of these issues we've been talking about, and particularly pay. Yeah. And what they're saying there is that there should be a fair pay policy, and it should be all about disclosure. And we're not just saying disclose, the ratio between top and bottom pay. something a lot more meaningful.
Gender,
So just explain how you devise pay. Explain the link in your thinking between the pay for, the board and the pay for junior level. I'm not saying it has to be the same. We're just saying if one goes up, shouldn't the other one go up? Those sort of explain the metrics. So I think that's just one example, but there are a lot of options that I think are worth examining.
And again, Kevin, if you were to kind of introduce anything or would like to see something coming on a formal or a more kind of purposeful basis, what would it be?
I think it's sort of to make sure we're not over-regulating and we're not bringing in too much sort of compliance, which is more focused on too many things, sort of sensible risk-based systems. I think if it's from a corporate governance perspective, I was smiling as Blana talked about the pay question, because I remember in a previous life, at one point there was a recommendation that management pay would be indexed to a milk price at one point, to the point of a good correlator to happy suppliers, happy management, unhappy suppliers, unhappy. But I think it's actually about keeping a sensible balance. I think the danger is half-baked initiatives that aren't properly thought through. And I really do come back to common sense and implementation, and the people on board, a company's board, are the more important things. And I go right back to the thing I said at the beginning of the strategy, the vision and the purpose of the company. Are you running it for the long term? And have you got a long-term perspective? Whether you're publicly, privately, state-owned, that doesn't matter. That's the same, if you like, sort of compass point. You then go down through customers, your people, and your shareholder. And you'll see that I put the shareholder last, because the shareholder isn't going to have shareholder value, isn't going to have a strategy that's implemented and executed, unless you're doing a good job with your customers and you're working well with your people. And we have a very complex stakeholder matrix in our business, and we have to manage all those stakeholders, and there's loads of issues. And you could have if you imagine getting here's how you have to do everything, you'd spend your whole time following form and very little time and substance. So I think actually, if I was Minister for a day, I'd make sure that any of the initiatives that were allowing over-regulation, and we have a lot of it, an over-focus on form rather than substance, were removed and kept removed, and that any initiatives had to be thought through in the round, because any sensible company will have to deal with all those issues. They can't just have the luxury of dealing with one. And I do go all the way back to in Idaho when I was involved in running one of those businesses, and we had to pay the milk suppliers the right price for milk all the time for a very simple reason. If we didn't, we wouldn't have any milk. We'd have been bust in 3 weeks if we didn't have any milk. So the fact that we didn't have 10 of the local farmers on the board locally, the fact that we weren't in a formal joint venture, actually at the end of the day didn't really matter in that sense. That's why I say it doesn't matter. It's what you do with what you have that matters, rather than being overly focused on a cookie cutter formula that has to have all these components and a special interest and a this and a that. And then you end up having a non-functional board. And I would say, with pride, the 2 boards I've been on in the last 17 years, the chairman has the boards roll up their sleeves, define a body of work, establish a way of working, and be very actively engaged in developing and working through an agenda through the year. And that's far, far more important than reporting back or we've got this, we've got that. It's actually what the board does.
Yeah. Okay, I want to just maybe one more question from the floor here before we finish up, if anyone hasn't had an opportunity. Sorry, this gentleman here, thanks.
Thank you. I'm also, like my colleague Barry, from the Worker Director Group. I'm from Unpost. And whilst we welcome, and it's great, the reason why we have this is because we're not really in our group it's not really, we're under pressure group because due to privatisation, we've lost a lot of our colleagues. So the reason why we're here really is to, and we sponsored this, is to basically to give some energy to the group and to bring this out to the public that worker directors, we feel we have an important role in society. So, and we do welcome, and it's great that management and employers do think that we're we have such we're nice people and we're actually welcome on boards. In practice, we're not really. So, and my question would be, and you asked there about remuneration and about the people in top and getting 350 whatever times the average
68,
employee.
Yeah.
However, in practice, and this is my question, maybe Blana will answer me after this. It's all very nice, the platitudes and all, but remuneration committees will make the difference, and who's going to get in there? Do you feel well, in my practice, in my area of seeing the last few years, being an employee director and a worker director, I haven't seen too many worker directors being on remuneration committees. So, and we've only a small thing in Ireland, and private companies are not obliged to have worker directors, so we've got just semi-states and a few public bodies who have worker directors. They're still not on remuneration committees. So it really now, what this is platitude. So basically, and going back to Jan's, maybe you can ask this, maybe the Commission has a role here. And in the Lisbon Treaty, the social impact in that, and maybe we should, looking on society as a whole, since this is what we are, since we're here now talking about it, perhaps we should broaden it and say, number one, why are worker directors not on remuneration committees? Even when they're worker directors, we've got to that far, we're still black there. But number two, maybe the Commission could bring some sort of legislation across Europe to force governments, because the employers, as our colleague down below said, just say no.
Thankfully, as moderator, you only pose the questions, you don't have to answer them. But Bláthnaid, it's kind of a valid point. You can do all do very well, you can get them on the board and you can tickle all those boxes. But if they're not actually on the committees or actually influencing those decisions, well then, is it tokenistic? And are they actually influencing those? Because it seems to me that a lot of the pressure on pay has come from, in many cases, shareholders, from the wider public, and latterly when there's kind of threats from various governments, so it's usually of the verbal kind rather than the substantive one. So do you think there is a valid point there that, it's all very well having your worker directors there, and we haven't even addressed the fact that the vast majority of people employed are actually in SMEs where they may have no voice in that at all?
Yeah. I took the liberty of looking at the TASC 2012 report, and it said exactly what you said, that, worker directors are not on remuneration committees. And it rang with me a little bit, because often in the discussions on diversity, they say, oh, it's fine to have women on boards, but if you look and see what they are, what jobs do you get? Are you chairing the audit committee? That's an important job. Are you chairing the risk committee? Are you chairing the budget committee? Or are you just on the committee? Remuneration committees themselves had a bit of a mixed history. So, when they were introduced originally, sort of in 1992 at the Cadbury, everyone thought this'll sort things out. It made things worse, because the people on the remuneration committee tended to be executive directors on other boards, and therefore there was a conflict, or they tended to look at external sort of benchmarks, and so everyone's salary raised. Why are they not? I mean, the one reason, I suppose, which you could say is that you're not supposed to have executives on remuneration committees anyway. They're supposed to be non-executive directors. So, if you have a worker director who by definition is an executive, that probably explains, why they're not on the remuneration committee. But does it mean that they couldn't be on a remuneration committee as a non-executive director on somebody else's board? That's an interesting question, because there you don't have the conflict of interest. You bring the knowledge and the know-how. And I think, and there you wouldn't have the conflicts of interest issue either, that you raised, where you're talking about information from one to the next. So that's, I think, possibly an interesting way. Just move around in that way a little bit. Now, of course, there's a question of being appointed to do that, but that, the argument would seem to be there.
And when you look at kind of social and corporate policy across the EU, what on a bigger picture level can the Commission do to address some of the issues?
Well, I certainly not expect them to do something in the field of remuneration. But what you see there is that there are some national initiatives. For instance, in the Netherlands, the outgoing government has been quite firm with regard to remuneration in all public enterprises, or those enterprises that depend, that are semi-public. Now, the problem at this moment, I think, with the European Commission and the policy in this area is that we are far away from, let's say, a more stakeholder-oriented model. And that has also to do partly with the jobs that Bláthnaid is involved in. For instance, it is almost self-evident for the experts in most of the advisory groups of the Commission that there is a split of the real seat, to give only one example. Although we know that not only because of the Panama Papers and so on, but also because of a lot of other experiences that we have with letterbox companies, that there are also serious arguments to go in a complete other direction. It is a hell of a job to change the course of a mammoth tanker, so to say. And company law has, like I said at the very beginning, since the mid-90s, has been seen as one of the production factors, like good infrastructure and so on, that you can use if you want to attract companies. And we have to get away from that model. You didn't ask me what I would do if I would become minister for one day.
Just one day.
It's a bit complicated also, but in one day you cannot do a lot. But
it's a magic wand you have. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Well, no, there are some things that inspire me. That could at least strengthen the position of stakeholders. And with stakeholders, I mean more than the workers' voice, because we have talked about the workers' voice. But what struck me in several situations in recent years was that, and I said it at the beginning, that the local community completely stayed out of the decision. Well, there are some countries where we have strong consultation rights for the workforce, or where there is even advisory right for the workforce, and in the Netherlands they can go to court and block the decisions. I think that it would be wise to make more stakeholders eligible in major restructuring, decisions that have to do with major restructurings, if there are clear negative consequences for the society. And then we get back to that idea that a company is a community with different actors and different interests that have to come to a deal, that have to negotiate and come to let's say, a deal that's not serves everyone and all the way they want to be served, but at least their interests are taken serious. So I think that could bring us back to perhaps a situation where you can say, well, we are more in a situation with a stakeholder model.
Yeah. Could I ask a question just of the worker directors here? So the same question, if you were in charge for a day,
Minister for a day.
What would you do? What one thing do you think would make a difference?
Here we go. Yeah.
And I'll write them down.
I'd increase Kevin's wages. I'd extend the legislation to the private sector.
Yeah.
Of companies of a certain size.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And starting with the banks. That's because of the history of how the banking industry collapsed a country, bankrupted countries. So I think that's a good start, and then companies of a certain size.
Because even think what Jan was talking about in terms of engaging community and other stakeholder interests, perhaps how different things might have been with NAMA, the banks and other things, had the community maybe had inputs into major decisions. But I think what maybe just to sum up and say, it's not something we are going to be able to solve by a single or perhaps even multiple acts of legislations. It's going to be as much about hearts and minds as using, I think what the panel has highlighted perhaps are the how company law can be both a tool, but it can be a very, very restrictive one. There's obviously a lot of diversity across Europe, and there's not going to be, I don't think, a one-size-fits-all solution there. But I think the greatest value probably of tonight, and I'm sorry to field the gentleman at the back who didn't agree, but I think probably the greatest benefit of tonight is that at least we're now finally having a debate about it, and I welcome the opportunity from TASC to have taken part in tonight's debate, and I'd like on your behalf to thank Jan, Bláthnaid and Kevin for speaking tonight. Thanks a million. Well done. Thank you, Bláthnaid.